Hey everyone, today I'm going to go over Pro Capture on the Olympus OMD EM1 Mark II. I believe pretty much it's the same setup for the EM1 Mark III and the EM1X. So we're going to go over what Pro Capture is, how to set it up in your camera. I'll show you guys how I've been taking images like this great spotted woodpecker using Pro Capture to capture it in flight, and give a few tips on how and when you want to change the settings. You want to deviate from kind of the default settings, so you can change them depending on the circumstances. I'm going to go over the differences between Pro Capture high and low, and stay tuned to the end because then I'll show you guys all the other settings on the camera that I have set up with it, and we'll make it all into a preset so that you can quickly access the Pro Capture feature in the field. There's a very important tip there that you need to remember when you're using Pro Capture. And that has to do with the saving to the memory card slot. So we'll go over that in the end. Stay tuned to that. So if you haven't seen any of my videos before, my name is Espen, and this channel is all about wildlife photography. So usually I take you guys with me out into the field for some photos of and take some photos of wildlife. So if you want to see more of those kind of videos, then please hit subscribe and hit that bell to be notified. So if you don't know what the Pro Capture is, it's basically like the flux capacitor.
This is what makes time travel possible. The flux capacitor.
Now, not quite a time machine, but it does allow you to save images from before you actually fully press the shutter button. So when you're using Pro Capture and you have pressed the shutter button, your camera will save the images in short-term memory. When you do press the shutter button, it will then save those images kind of back in time when you were just half pressing the shutter button. But if you let go of the button, it will delete those images. And that makes it perfect for capturing birds in flight. And especially when you're waiting for an action, you're waiting for a bird to take off or maybe come land somewhere, because then you can actually see the action and then you fully press the shutter button, and then it saves those images of the action that just happened. So there are two different modes for Pro Capture on the Olympus. One of them is high, the other one is low. Now Pro Capture low allows you for a maximum of 18 frames per second, and you can photograph 35 frames from before you press the shutter, so pre-shutter frames, and there's no limit for how many frames you want to take after you press the shutter, and you can keep holding it and keep taking images. The Pro Capture low is limited to 18 frames per second, but it does allow you to continuously focus on your subject. So I tend to use Pro Capture low when I'm photographing birds already in flight. So with Pro Capture high, you can actually get 60 frames per second. You can get 35 frames before you actually fully press the shutter button, and then you can get up to 99 total, so another 64 frames from after you press the shutter button if you keep holding it. With Pro Capture high, you are limited to locked focus, so a single focus. Once you get your focus, and once you start, half pressing the shutter button, that's it. Your focus is then locked. So I tend to use Pro Capture high for stationary birds and waiting for them to fly. So focus on the bird, half press the shutter button, compose my scene, and then once I see the bird flies, I actually fully press the shutter button, and then it goes up to 35 frames back in time, or back to save those frames from before I actually fully press the shutter button. Now you can set the settings for how many frames you want before you press the shutter button and how many frames you want after. So we'll go over that now. Now, when I was doing a bit of research on how to set this up for my own camera, I came across a blog by Thomas Sturr, and it's called Pro Capture in Reverse. I'll put a link in the description below to it. I think that was quite good, and it was useful for me to kind of get my head around it. And also thanks to Mauro for pointing that out and sending me the link for that. And basically in it, he recommends starting with 15 pre-shutter frames, which basically means you take 15 frames before you fully press the shutter, and no frames after. And I think that can be good as kind of a tester shot. When using Pro Capture, there are many things that that actually affect how many frames you actually want to be saving. And it depends on things like how fast you are reacting. It depends on how fast the bird is, and how loose the frame is, how how much of an area does the bird actually have to fly in your frames. If it's a bigger area or a small bird and a wide frame or a loose composition, you're going to need more frames so that you have the most chances of capturing the action all the way out. So if we set it then to 15 and 15 and we take a test sequence, basically if your first image of that sequence looks like this, where the bird has already taken flight, then your reaction time might be a little bit slow and you need to add more pre-shutter frames. So then you increase the shutter frames to, let's say, 18 or 20 or something like that, giving you 20 frames from before you press the shutter. But remember, you have to then increase the limit as well to 20. Now, if your last frame in the sequence looks something like this, where the bird actually has more space to fly in the frame, and you think that those potential images could be keepers, then you're going to want to add some frames to after you press the shutter. The frame limit to 18 or something like that. So that means that you take 15 pre-shutter frames and then another 3 after you press the shutter button. But this can work on both ways. So you may have to add some more pre-shutter frames and a few more from after you press the shutter. And that's the way you kind of fine-tune how you use it. Now it's going to be different from situation to situation. And for myself, I found that as a default, I'd rather have a few more extra frames and not capture the action. So my default settings for this is going to be 60 frames per second, and I use 17 pre-shutter frames, and then I go with a limit of 21 frames. That gives me 17 frames from before I actually fully press the shutter, and then an extra 4 frames from after I press the shutter. And then I can just adjust it depending on the situation and what I'm shooting. But usually that gives me enough images for whatever I'm photographing. So to get the settings that you want for Pro Capture High and Low, go into the menu, then you go into the little cog wheel, and you go down to C1, and over there you see the multiple frames, and you see low settings and you see high settings. So if we dive into high settings first, next to there we go to Pro Cap, move one over, and then we go to the main kind of area where we can set everything. Now you see the first one there is maximum frames per second. So I'm going to leave that at 60 because I want as many frames as possible, because that allows you to get that, wing motion that you want. You want to get the bird sharp, you want to get the best wing motion, or the wing kind of placement. So 60 frames per second is going to give you the best chance of getting that. And then I go with a limit of 21 frames. And for the pre-shutter frames, 17 pre-shutter frames, that gives me 17 frames from before I actually fully press the shutter, and then an extra 4 frames from after I press the shutter. Okay then, so that's the setup for Pro Capture High. Now, if you go back into the menu button, we go down to C1 and we go to the L settings, which is the low settings, and Pro Cap. And for Pro Capture Low, I like to have a very different setup, because here it only allows you 18 frames per second, and I tend to use that when I'm photographing birds that are already in flight. I tend to set my pre-shutter frames to 9, which gives me actually half a second back from before I press the shutter, and I turn my frame count limiter to off. I don't feel like I need any cap there, because as I said, I use this for shooting birds that are already in flight most of the time. And that way I can just keep continuous focus on the bird, and if I want to, I can keep holding that shutter button down so that I keep taking images after I've actually pressed the shutter, because it might be that something is continuously flying and there's more action to be had, and I want to keep taking those images. And also 18 frames per second is a lot easier to control, so it's a lot easier for me to just let go of the button when I want to. And obviously you tend to take a few more images, but that's worth it to me, so I don't put a cap on how many frames I take for Pro Capture Low. So once you've saved those settings for Pro Capture Low and High, they're saved so that when you want to shoot Pro Capture, you can access it through either the Super Control panel. You just press OK and you head into the your shooting mode, and you go down to Pro Capture Low or High. You can also use the quicker button up top here. Press that. You can also use the dial up back here or the joystick, but again here to choose Pro Capture low or high. So then let's just dive through some of the other settings that I use on the camera, and then we'll make it all into a preset. So first off, you're going to want to put your mode into how you prefer to shoot birds in flight. If you're a beginner, I would put it in shutter priority mode. If you know about what you're doing, then you put it in full manual. I like full manual, so I'll put it in M on the mode dial, and then I'll start entering the other settings. These settings are all easily accessed through the super control panel, so basically just press OK, and then we go through from here. I'm going to want to set a few things to automatic. So my ISO, we're going to set to automatic, and then for my shutter speed, I'm going to set it to 1/1600th of a second. Now 1/1600th of a second is good enough to mostly freeze the action for medium to smallish sized birds. It was good enough to freeze the action, at least the eye and the head, for the great spotted woodpeckers that I took images of. There isn't blur to the wings, but I quite like that. If you get down to much smaller birds, you're going to need a higher shutter speed. So I think that 1/1600th of a second is a good starting point, and it's an easy change from there with just changing the dials to the shutter speed that you need when you're in the field. From there, I'm going to set my, I'm shooting with the 300mm f4 lens. I'm going to want to use it wide open, so it gives me most amount of light, so I'm going to set it to f4. Now for other types of settings, I'm going to set my white balance to automatic. I'm going to set my focus point to one spot in the middle. You may want to change that to a cluster of 5 points, depending on how accurate you feel at finding a bird in flight. Sometimes, and especially if you're photographing larger birds, it could be easier to use 5 cluster points. But I like to keep mine at 1, and I can always change it depending on the circumstances in the field. Other than that, I'm going to put my continuous autofocus on. I'm not going to be using the tracking, because I found that on my camera, the EM1 Mark II, the tracking isn't always that good, so I'm not going to want to keep that as a default. I may try and experiment a bit more with it. I'll put my face priority off. Image stabilization I set to automatic. Now for the Pro Capture mode that I want to start in on my preset is going to be low. Now the reason for that is that I'm most likely to want to have quick access to that because I'm using it for birds in flight. So one of the most important things you have to remember is where you save your images. And it is also incredibly important that you get yourself a fast memory card. I use, and I can recommend one of these, which is the Sony Tough Memory Card. And you have to make sure that you not only get a high reading speed, but you need a high writing speed. And this one has 299 megabyte per second writing speed. So I'll put a link to that in the description. If you don't have a fast memory card, and I've tried it before with a slow one, it's just going to continuously buffer, and you're not going to be allowed to shoot any kind of picture until it's finished buffering. This is a very fast card, and very often it allows me to keep shooting. Buffering just very rarely is going to stop me from keep shooting. But other than just having that memory card, it's very important as well that on the EM1 Mark II, there are 2 memory slots, and you have to make sure you put it into memory card slot 1. So that is the one closest to the top here, because memory card slot 1 is the only one that's actually take full advantage of the UHS 2 memory cards, maybe basically the faster memory cards like this one. And so when you put it in there, it doesn't stop there. You have to make sure that you save those types of shots directly onto memory card slot 1. So we're going to include that in our preset. To do that, we go into the super control panel by pressing OK. Down in the left corner, there is a little SD card symbol, save settings, go into that. Save settings, I keep that first one for standard, so that it only records to the assigned card only. And then we go down to save slot, and you choose slot 1, which is the one we put the fast memory card in. And we want to save that as part of our preset, so that we're always, when we're using Pro Capture, we're saving to the fast memory card, and that's going to allow us to actually take full advantage of Pro Capture. Maybe the SD card is actually the flux capacitor.
This is what makes time travel possible.
Now, it's very important that for everything else, when you're just taking normal images or you're filming video, you're going to want to keep a separate card in card slot 2, maybe one that's a bit slower and cheaper card but has loads of space on it. And you want to save everything else to memory card slot 2, so you don't waste valuable space when you're not using Pro Capture and using your fast memory card. So I hope that makes sense. There's also a blog post on my website that goes a little bit deeper into it, and it's written down, so if I'm talking too fast or maybe I missed something, you can find out more information in that blog post. Once we got all our settings right, we go into menu, and we go up to basically the camera and 1, and we go into reset/custom modes, and we go down 1 to assign custom mode. So I like to use C1, custom mode 1, because that is right next to manual, so it's just a quick turn of the mode dial and I'm in Pro Capture mode. So that's what I use. I then assign to custom mode, and we go into set, and we just hit set on custom mode 1, or whichever other one you want to save it to. So then whenever I want to access these, I quickly just change to C1, and I can check here that everything is set up the way I want it to there. Capturing these birds in flight, you're very often going to be using high shutter speeds, and with that comes high ISO. So I can definitely recommend Topaz Denoise to get rid of some of that noise that the ISO, that high ISO introduces to your images. You can check out more in the video that I have on it up here, where you can see some examples of how it cleans up those images really well. They come up with some new updates as well, so it works even better these days. So check that out, and it should be quite useful. I hope that all made sense, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll address them there. Also, I'll leave a link up here to the blog post on this, so it's a lot easier maybe, so you can follow step by step on the blog post where it's written out. And in case I missed something in this video or I talk a little bit too fast, it might be an idea to just check out the blog post and you can go through it step by step there. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.